The town of Clearbrook prided itself on its quiet streets, tree-lined sidewalks, and the low red brick school that sat at the center of its community. On weekdays, the sound of children's laughter spilled out of its open windows, blending with the hum of bees in the flower beds along the front lawn. From the outside, there was nothing remarkable about it, just another small-town school where everyone knew everyone else's name. That spring, however, something odd began to happen on the far edge of the playground. Near the chain-link fence that marked the boundary between school grounds and the stretch of overgrown land beyond, small piles of sandy soil started to appear. At first, the janitor, Mr. Fields, assumed it was the work of local dogs digging under the fence. But the holes kept reappearing, always in roughly the same spots, always deeper than before. One morning, as the early sun cast long shadows over the dewy grass, a fourth grader named Ella spotted the culprit. She had arrived early, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she skipped toward the swing set. Pausing near the far fence, she noticed movement in the weeds beyond. A slender, rust-red fox, its coat catching the light in fiery tones, was crouched over one of the holes, pawing at the earth with quick, practiced motions. Its ears twitched at every sound, but it didn't run, not even when Ella whispered a surprised, "Hey!" She stood frozen, watching the animal dig with a strange persistence. Every few minutes it stopped, sniffed the air, and scraped again in exactly the same place. Then, without warning, it trotted off into the brush, tail flicking like a banner. When Ella told Mr. Fields, he chuckled, muttering something about wildlife being bolder these days. Still, when he walked out to look, he frowned at the depth of the fresh burrow. The soil at the bottom wasn't the same loose, loamy dirt that covered most of the schoolyard. It was paler, almost clay-like, and gave off a faint, unpleasant odor when disturbed. Over the next week, the fox returned again and again. Sometimes teachers spotted it at dawn while unlocking the building. Once, a group of boys claimed they saw it carrying something in its mouth, though no one could agree on what it was. The holes multiplied, first 2, then 5, then a dozen small mounds scattered along the fence line. The principal, Mrs. Hartley, eventually called in the local animal control officer, both to protect the fox and to stop it from tearing up the playground. Officer Jim Calder showed up with a humane trap and a clipboard, but after inspecting the burrows, he didn't set the trap right away. He knelt by one of the holes, scooped up a handful of the pale soil, and gave it a cautious sniff. Then, his expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Mrs. Hartley to notice. "This isn't just normal digging," he said finally, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Something's making that fox keep coming back here, and I'm not sure it's looking for food." No one knew it yet, but the fox's stubborn burrows were about to uncover a danger buried deeper than anyone wanted to imagine. By the next morning, the story of the fox and its mysterious digging had made the rounds among the staff. Teachers swapped theories over coffee, everything from hidden caches of rabbit bones to the fox building a den for her kits. Mrs. Hartley tried to keep the chatter down, worried it might become a distraction for the students, but she couldn't help glancing out the window toward the fence each time she passed her office. Officer Calder returned, this time with a small case containing sample bags, gloves, and a portable soil testing kit. "Just a precaution," he told Mrs. Hartley, though his tone carried a weight that didn't match his casual words. When the first recess bell rang, he walked the perimeter of the playground, stopping at each of the fox's burrows. He crouched, carefully scooping soil into Ziploc bags, labeling each with neat black letters. The pale clay-like dirt seemed to be coming from just below the normal dark topsoil, as if the fox's claws had cut through a skin to something hidden underneath. As he worked, several curious students approached. Ella was among them, standing with her hands clasped behind her back. "Do you think she's making a home here?" she asked, glancing toward the brush beyond the fence. Calder looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Maybe. Or maybe she smells something we can't." The words stuck in Ella's mind. Smells something we can't. By midday, the results from his portable kit began to take shape. The first readings showed elevated levels of certain metals, lead, and traces of something more troubling. Solvents often found in industrial waste. His brow furrowed as he compared one sample to another. The pattern was consistent, whatever this was. It wasn't an isolated patch. Mrs. Hartley joined him by the fence. Well, I'm not ready to say for sure, Calder replied quietly, but I don't like what I'm seeing. This isn't normal for soil near a school, especially not with kids playing this close every day. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion from the far corner. The fox had returned. It trotted right across the playground's edge in broad daylight, ignoring the shouts of children pointing and calling to each other. Without hesitation, it darted to a half-dug burrow, scraped furiously for a moment, then stopped, nose pressed to the ground. Calder's eyes followed the movement intently. She's on to something, he murmured, and as the fox vanished once more through a gap in the fence, a thought settled heavily in both their minds. If this animal was reacting to whatever lay beneath, the danger might not be just about a few holes in the dirt. Something was buried here, something that didn't belong. 2 days later, the chain-link fence at the back of the school was lined with orange safety tape, fluttering in the wind like a warning banner. Mrs. Hartley had cordoned off the area after Officer Calder insisted that no children should be near it until a deeper inspection could be done. Parents had started to ask questions, their voices tight with concern, but Calder was careful with his answers. We're just looking into a possible contamination issue, he repeated, though the word possible felt thinner each time he said it. That morning, he arrived with 2 colleagues from the county's Environmental Response Unit, both in faded green work jackets, their tool cases heavy with sampling gear. They moved with quiet purpose, taking measurements, pushing long soil probes into the ground, and logging GPS coordinates for each site. The fox made her appearance again, almost as if she'd been waiting for them. She padded along the outside of the fence, nose to the ground, pausing at a new spot about 10 feet from her earlier burrows. She began to dig with the same relentless rhythm, her paws sending clumps of soil behind her. One of the environmental techs glanced at Calder. She's showing you where to look. Calder didn't argue. He crossed to the spot, knelt, and cleared away the loose dirt. His gloved fingers touched something solid, something that wasn't stone. It was the corner of a rusted metal drum, just visible beneath the pale clay layer. A thin, oily sheen glistened on the surface where moisture had collected. Even through the gloves, he imagined he could feel the cold of it, like touching something that didn't belong to the living earth. They uncovered just enough to confirm it wasn't alone. Probing along the fence line revealed at least 3 other buried drums, spaced in a neat row as though deliberately placed there years ago. The soil around them gave off a faint chemical tang, sharp and unnatural. Mrs. Hartley came to the edge of the taped zone, her voice low but urgent. Tell me, what is it? Calder met her eyes. Industrial waste, likely solvents or oils. And by the look of it, it's been here for decades. Her face went pale. But this is right next to the playground. He nodded grimly. I'm calling in the state hazmat team. They'll need to excavate, test the air, and secure the site before anything else. No one's setting foot here until it's safe. As the environmental crew packed up to send their samples to a proper lab, the fox slipped away again into the undergrowth, her tail vanishing like a red flame into the weeds. Calder watched her go, the truth settling heavily in his chest. Without her relentless digging, those drums might have stayed buried until they ruptured fully, until the toxins leached far enough to reach the school's drinking water or the soil where children played every day. For now, the danger was contained. But he knew the hardest part was still ahead, figuring out who had buried them and why they'd chosen this place. The next morning, the hazmat trucks arrived before sunrise, their engines rumbling softly in the cool dawn air. By the time the first rays of light spilled over the school roof, a temporary operations zone had taken shape. Yellow tents, portable floodlights, sealed waste containers waiting in neat rows. Workers in full protective suits moved like pale ghosts against the green edge of the overgrown lot. Calder stood with Mrs. Hartley just outside the cordon, briefing her on what they expected to find. The drums are old. Judging by the rust, they could have been buried 30, maybe 40 years ago. Back then, regulations were laxer. Companies sometimes dumped waste where they thought no one would notice. He paused, glancing toward the fence. This property line used to be different. Before the school expanded, that strip of land might have belonged to an industrial yard. Mrs. Hartley's brow furrowed. So you're saying someone knew this was here when they sold the land? Or they counted on it being forgotten, Calder said. By mid-morning, the first drum was lifted from the earth. The crane's steel cable groaned as the corroded cylinder broke free of the soil, dripping muddy water that carried a faint rainbow sheen. Workers eased it into a lined container, where it was immediately sealed. Even from several yards away, the smell was acrid, like burnt plastic mixed with something metallic. As the excavation continued, the hazmat crew uncovered more than just drums. There were twisted lengths of piping, fragments of shattered glass, and small, unlabeled canisters that had degraded to little more than crumbling shells. Each piece was documented, photographed, and logged for analysis. Between the work's steady rhythm, Calder wandered along the fence line, tracing the fox's old burrow trails with his eyes. It was uncanny. Almost every one of her digging sites was within a few feet of buried material. She must have smelled the chemical vapors, one hazmat technician remarked when Calder mentioned it. Animals pick up on that stuff even in tiny concentrations. Probably made her curious or cautious. The thought gnawed at him. The fox hadn't just stumbled across one drum. She'd been mapping the entire buried line without knowing it. Her persistence was the reason they'd caught it before the contents could leak into the groundwater. In the early afternoon, Mrs. Hartley stepped away to take a phone call. Calder overheard enough to guess it was the district superintendent, no doubt discussing the logistics of keeping the school open, while part of its grounds were treated like a hazardous crime scene. When she returned, her expression was tight. Parents are scared, she admitted. Some want to pull their kids out until this is over. I don't blame them. Calder looked back at the sealed containers lined up in the sun. Scared is good, he said. It means they understand the danger. It also means we have a better chance of making sure this never happens again. Somewhere beyond the commotion, in the tangle of weeds and wildflowers, the fox watched unseen, her amber eyes reflecting the flicker of sunlight on the workers' suits. The grove behind the school had been her hunting ground for years. Now, unknowingly, she had become its most important whistleblower. By the third day of excavation, the last of the drums had been removed, each one sealed in a reinforced container for transport to a licensed disposal site. The air around the cordoned zone was cleaner now, but the scars in the earth told a story. The neat row of pits where the drums had lain, like rotten teeth pulled from a jaw. Calder's focus shifted from removal to investigation. The waste hadn't buried itself, and someone somewhere had made the decision to hide it here. He started with the county archives, driving to the records office in the municipal building. In a back room that smelled faintly of dust and copier toner, he sifted through decades-old property maps, deed transfers, and zoning changes. It didn't take long to find it. In the late 1970s, the strip of land behind what was now the school had been part of a small manufacturing facility, Clearbrook Metalworks, Inc. The name didn't ring a bell. The company had dissolved in the mid-80s, but one line in an inspection report caught his attention. Cited for improper waste storage. Follow-up inspection incomplete. By the time the school board purchased the property in the 90s, the lot had been vacant for years. The seller had provided a standard environmental clearance letter, but Calder knew enough to suspect that either the inspection was sloppy or the paperwork had been massaged. He took his findings to Mrs. Hartley that afternoon. She sat behind her desk, hands folded, as he laid out the documents. If this report had been followed up properly, he said, tapping the yellowed page, those drums would have been removed before the school was even built. She shook her head slowly. Instead, they've been sitting there for 30 years, under the feet of our kids. Calder nodded. And if it weren't for that fox, we might not have found them until they leaked completely. They decided to call a special town meeting for the following week. Parents, teachers, and officials would hear the facts directly. Calder also planned to invite the Environmental Agency's regional director, someone with enough authority to promise enforcement if other sites like this existed nearby. That evening, as Calder walked the now quiet schoolyard, he saw a familiar flash of red near the far fence. The fox was there again, sniffing at the edges of the freshly filled pits. She looked healthy, alert, her coat shining in the fading sunlight. For a moment, Calder wondered if she recognized that her digging had changed something here, or if, in her mind, she was simply following an old habit. He watched as she trotted off toward the tree line, her paws leaving faint impressions in the damp soil. Behind her, the school windows glowed warmly, children's voices carrying faintly into the evening air. The danger had been pulled from the ground, but its shadow lingered, in paperwork, in unanswered questions, and in the history of a town that now knew what lay beneath its feet. The town hall was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner of the old municipal building's assembly room, and still, people stood shoulder to shoulder at the back. Parents clutched notepads, teachers sat in small clusters, and a few reporters from the county paper had set up near the front with cameras and recorders. Mrs. Hartley sat at the long oak table alongside Calder, the county environmental officer, and the school board chair. The air was tense, half worry, half anger. Outside, a warm spring rain pattered against the tall windows, but inside the room, every creak of the old floorboards seemed amplified. Calder began with a short timeline, using projected photos of the excavation site. These drums were buried sometime between 1978 and 1983, based on their make and the condition of the metal. They contained industrial solvents and petroleum byproducts, both dangerous if they leach into groundwater or are inhaled as vapors. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One father stood. Were our kids in danger? Calder didn't soften the answer. Yes, especially if the drums had corroded further. We caught it early enough to avoid serious exposure, but the proximity to the playground was unacceptable. The environmental officer spoke next, explaining the testing process and promising a full site remediation. We'll be removing contaminated soil and replacing it with clean fill. Air quality has already improved, but we'll continue monitoring for weeks. Then came the questions. Parents wanted to know why the land hadn't been cleared before the school was built, why no one had discovered the waste in 30 years, and whether other parts of Clearbrook hid similar dangers. Calder explained the history of Clearbrook Metalworks, the incomplete inspection in 1979, and the land transfer in the 90s that somehow passed without thorough environmental review. It was Mrs. Hartley who, near the end, brought up the fox. I think it's important for all of you to know how this started, she said. One of our students noticed a fox digging along the fence line. Officer Calder realized those burrows were revealing something unusual in the soil. If not for that animal's persistence, the waste might still be buried there today. That sparked a different kind of murmur. Surprise, a hint of admiration. Someone joked about making the fox the school's mascot, and the tension in the room lightened just a fraction. By the time the meeting adjourned, people left with more answers than they'd had before, and a clear sense that this was not the end of the story. The town now expected a thorough cleanup and accountability for whoever had left the waste behind. As Calder stepped out into the rain, the cool air hit his face, carrying the scent of wet pavement and the faint, fresh smell of spring leaves. In the darkness beyond the streetlights, he thought he saw a shape move along the edge of the park, a low, sleek silhouette with a tail like a brushstroke. The fox, perhaps, keeping her own quiet watch over the place she'd unwittingly saved. A week after the town meeting, the school grounds looked almost unrecognizable. The fence line where the fox had dug was now a wide strip of freshly turned earth, the pale clay replaced with rich, dark soil, trucked in from a certified clean site. The playground had been reopened in stages, though the far corner remained marked with bright orange cones until final test results confirmed it was safe. Calder returned one quiet afternoon to collect follow-up air and soil samples. The day was warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of lilacs from a nearby yard. Children's laughter floated from the swings, blending with the clink of metal as a few workers dismantled the last of the hazmat staging area. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots sinking slightly in the new soil, eyes scanning for anything unusual. That was when he saw her, down by the very corner where it had all begun. The fox. She was smaller up close than he remembered, though her coat still held that deep rust-red glow in the sunlight. She stood with her nose low to the ground, sniffing the new earth as if testing the work humans had done. Then, without the urgency she'd shown before, she began to dig, not in the frantic bursts that had first caught Ella's attention, but in slow, deliberate motions. Calder stepped closer, watching as she unearthed nothing more than a clump of roots and a wriggling earthworm. She ate the worm, glanced up briefly as if acknowledging him, and then trotted away toward the stand of trees beyond the schoolyard. Calder knelt where she'd been digging. The soil smelled clean now, just earth and spring growth. No acrid tang, no metallic bite. The job was done. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the fox had been checking their work. Her instincts tuned to a register humans often ignored until it was too late. That evening, he filed his final report. The hazardous waste had been removed, the soil replaced, and the groundwater tested clear. The case against whoever had ordered the original dumping was still open, but the immediate threat to the children and the community was gone. In the closing notes, he added a line that wasn't standard in environmental reports. Initial discovery credited to repeated burrowing behavior of local red fox, Vulpes vulpes, likely responding to chemical odor emissions. Weeks later, when the school hosted its spring fair, a new banner hung along the fence, a stylized fox in mid-step, tail curved high, framed by the words Clearbrook Guardians. Ella se iluminó cuando lo vio, sabiendo exactamente quién lo honraba. Somewhere beyond the edge of town, the fox's den lay quiet under the shade of young pines. She had moved on, following the rhythms of her own life. But in Clearbrook, her story remained, woven into the history of a place that had been saved by the smallest of habits, repeated until someone finally paid attention.